the Dodge Daytona Shelby, and shaky camera work. Two things which haven't left us since the 80s. The Shelby Dodges were always known as pretty quick cars. Nobody really expected the little front-wheel drive cars to be as quick as they were, but if you crank up the boost, you're really onto something. Now I think there's one thing that even die-hard car guys from the 80s think the Daytona was missing though. Sleeper status. Unbeknownst to most, but beknownst to a few, they put the 2.2 turbo in about everything Chrysler made in the 80s. This New Yorker has had some pretty significant engine upgrades over the last couple of years, and it moves fairly well. However, the one area it really lacks is handling in the braking department. I mean, this thing won't really stop for much of anything. The New Yorker came with a sweet front-to-back rake that looked pretty funny even back when. We're going to change that today with the installation of some Koni struts and 11¼ inch vented discs in the front of the car. It will be glorious. To get started, we'll go ahead and jack up the car. Might as well use a jack stand since I'm a pretty big fan of my body parts. Once we get the front wheel off, we can have a look at the tiny front brakes that came on the car. They're not super small by any means, but they're certainly nothing to brag about either. The new 11-inch vented discs that we're going to be putting on the car will be something to brag about though, so can't wait for that to happen. In order to pull off this swap, we'll need to remove the axle nut with a 32mm socket. If you don't have an impact, you can get this done with the car on the ground still. They can be a real doozy, so just go ahead and make sure you got a decent breaker bar. After I do the axle nut, I like to pull off the ball joint. Hopefully someone put a pinch bolt in from the rear, because that way it's a lot easier to get out. Just use a 15mm socket on the back and an 18mm wrench on the front. Once that's out, you can remove the 21mm nuts from the bolts that hold the strut into the place. The tie rods will need to come off the knuckle also, so you'll go ahead and take an 18mm socket and remove the castle nut after you've taken out the cotter pin. I find a hammer really helps to pop the tie rod from the knuckle. 13mm nuts. Hold the strut to the car up top. Remove those 3 nuts and the strut will drop right out. Just make sure to remember the 10mm bolts that hold the brake hoses to the strut. Use a 16mm wrench to free the brake hose from the old caliper, and the knuckle's ready to come on out. If you've done it correctly, the knuckle will come right off and leave the axle behind. Make sure not to leave the axle hanging or it could leak trans fluid, or it also could become separated internally, and those can be a pain to get back together. Here are the Koni struts, knuckles, and 60mm calipers off my CSX, which I recently replaced with some BC coilovers and the later style 11-inch brakes. While not brand new, these units should offer a night and day difference over what was on there before. I'll be thrilled to have this all out of the corner of my garage, and as for the discs, I was able to pick up some Brembo parts off of Amazon for about 25 bucks a piece. Not bad at all in my opinion, really. I generally check Rock Auto and Amazon to see who has the better prices. However, for brake parts, I usually pick the company which lists the diameter of the rotor, pistons, or whatever, so I can know for sure what I'm going to get in the mail. There's nothing worse than getting the standard brake parts when you've ordered up the 11-inch brakes for these cars. It's happened to me more times than I care to count. Installing the new stuff's pretty straightforward since it's the opposite of removal. Make sure when you put the new knuckle on that you have the ball joint fairly well aligned with the opening at the bottom of the knuckle. That'll really help to make sure you get the pinch bolt in with minimal stress. Don't forget the washer from the axle nut. I've done that a few times and it's not fun to break the nut loose when you're just going to retorque it again right after you're done. I generally put the strut in at the top first and thread the nuts down into the strut hat by hand. Then I'll pull the bolts through the strut and knuckle before torquing those down. I just dialed in as much camber as I could with this since I'm going to go ahead and do the alignment in the garage very soon. Since we have the strut and knuckle installed, it's time to do the brakes. Go ahead and put a disc on the hub and load the brake pads into the caliper. I generally run a lug nut down a stud so that the disc is held steady, but I didn't do that today for some reason, so you won't see me doing that on the video. Throw a caliper and bolts onto the knuckle there and rotate the caliper in so that you can snug them down with the caliper bolts. At this point, you're ready to go ahead and install the banjo bolt and bleed the brakes. I always buy speed bleeders because they're pretty cheap and they make life a lot easier than trying to do anything else. I've been using DOT 5.1 brake fluid a lot lately. It's not too much more expensive than the regular DOT 3 fluid, and its properties far surpass anything that the DOT 3 fluid can offer. I do some occasional autocrossing and a lot of spirited driving, and it's just cheap insurance to know that the boiling point of your fluid is going to be so much higher than that of normal brake fluid. With the brakes on the car, it's time to go ahead and torque the axle nut to 180 foot-pounds, and then the lug nuts torque them to 85 to 115 foot-pounds. I generally do 90 foot-pounds. It makes everything a lot easier. I don't have any problems with studs, and I've never lost a wheel. I found that life's much easier if you actually use the torque wrench rather than just jamming the nut on with an impact. There are few things in life worse than needing to get a 6 or 8 foot cheater bar on a breaker bar so that way you can get an axle nut loose. I've had to do that before and it was a nightmare. Okay, we'll go ahead and look at this. I'm not sure how visible it is on the film here, but I had a solid of 1.5 inches of drop with the new struts and springs. Gave the car a totally new look, and it is way nicer. Took a brief test drive, and I'm thinking that a larger master cylinder is going to be in order. I could probably get by with the one that's on the car since I've just got drums in the rear, but I'm not one to cut corners with brakes. I just think that we need to go ahead and upgrade. So stay tuned for a few more updates on this.